I often hear a lot of grumbling from you, Adler Nation, about why Canadian taxpayers are forced to dump $1.1 billion into the state broadcaster, the CBC, every year, and why the Conservative government has increased funding to the state broadcaster every year. Well, let's ask James Moore, the minister responsible for the CBC, for his reasons.
It's a key institution for uniting the country, and that's why we have increased funding for the CBC.
Moore is right. Technically, the Broadcast Act states that part of the CBC's mandate is to contribute to shared national consciousness and identity. Hey, who doesn't want to unite the country? Nobody, of course. All makes sense now, right? Wrong.
Another prominent Quebecer is in the media spotlight today. Gilles Duceppe is stepping into a new role as radio host here at CBC. The former leader of the Bloc Québécois will be hitting the airwaves with a weekly segment on our sister network, Radio-Canada. The show is expected to debut next Thursday. Duceppe says he's hoping to tackle topics that will really make listeners think, like the debt crisis or health and education systems.
Yeah, they're all about unity. And you heard that right. The CBC might have not called him a separatist in that clip. They wouldn't. But Adler Nation knows who Gilles Duceppe is. The guy who spent the last couple of decades trying to break up our country. Does the hiring of Gilles Duceppe speak to that? Joining me now is Ottawa Sun columnist John Robson. John, on a scale of 1 to 10, how surprised were you that CBC Radio French was highly motivated to hire Duceppe?
Somewhere around a 3, I think. I regard the decision as quite an offensive one, but it's in keeping with the way they proceed, so it annoys me without actually shocking me. Well,
I don't know if you remember, but in the course of the referendum campaign, there were many members of the side that said we to separation, which means no to Canada. There were many people on the we side who were very, very grateful to CBC Radio-Canada, that's the French arm of the CBC, where Gilles Duceppe is going. Very grateful to them. And there were some who even said that having Radio-Canada, state broadcaster French, as an ally to the we movement was worth anywhere from 5 to 15 points.
Yeah, it's a very strange situation, isn't it, where almost the best place from which to combat government policy in this country and indeed to seek to undermine the nature of the country, even its political unity, is on the public payroll. You know, we've had a lot of trouble from public sector unions opposing policy. You've got all this trouble from the CBC Radio-Canada. And of course, academics working in publicly funded universities are some of the people who are most hostile to the values of the society that nurtures them. And this, to me, is just one more example of that. You know, I would like to say that in following him when he was in politics, I often found that Gilles Duceppe was a remarkably lucid and honest man. I didn't like his premises, but he seemed to get from them to his conclusions rather better than most party leaders. If he were hired by a private network, it would not bother me. Whether he, you know, I don't mind networks hiring former separatists, and I don't mind networks having current separatists. It's an important current of thought. But when the man spends decades, as you say, trying to break up Canada, finally Quebecers have had enough of him, and Radio-Canada says, no, it's a vital voice in the public sphere. Gilles Duceppe speaks for Quebec, he must be heard. It's like, well, that's not even what the voters just said. What are you doing bringing this guy on board at the expense of the taxpayer?
John, what do you think Gilles Duceppe will be using his platform for? I mean, do you honestly believe he has no political ambitions, no political machinations, no desire to further his cause, that somehow he's given his cause up and just wants to become a radio dude?
Well, yes, yes, and no. I suspect that Mr. Duceppe is done with politics. I mean, it's a wearying life, and he was in it for a long time. I don't think he wants to get back into it. But when Radio-Canada tells us, and he says, well, there won't be any politics, in the strictest possible sense, that may be true. He won't come on and say, I think so-and-so should lead a party. But in the mind of someone like Gilles Duceppe, and here I'm with him, virtually everything is connected to politics, to the struggle over culture, to the meaning of life in the public square. So all of his remarks will have implications for public policy. He says he wants to talk about healthcare, the debt crisis. Well, how do you not talk about governance when you're talking about that? And again, it may even be that he'll have interesting things to say. Gilles Duceppe was not one for pulling his punches, which so many politicians just seem to me to put out mush all the time. Gilles Duceppe never had that problem. He could be interesting, but not, please, out of of my pocket. That's the problem here. I don't want him hired by the network that's meant to unite the country to help pry it apart at my expense. That's where I have a problem with it.
John, just put yourself in media mode for a moment. You're, the executive producer of French CBC, and you're looking for someone that is highly reliable to whack the Conservative majority government and Stephen Harper, to consistently whack them. Who would you hire?
Well, in this case, honestly, not Gilles Duceppe, because the terms of the hire, they do have a rule about former politicians, and if he goes too far over, they'll be so embarrassed by it that they would have to do something. So I don't think it's actually in that spirit. I think it's more on the Nicole Turmel problem, that over there, separatism, active separatism, isn't regarded as a bad thing. You know, there are those who think Canada should be broken up immediately. There are those who think it's too much trouble, and there's the divide. And so those on one side don't mind hiring people on the other side, and they're all good buddies. And that's what galls me so much about it, to say that the man who spent his active political career trying to break up Canada should now be hired by the state broadcaster whose job is to unify the country is an insult to everybody for whom separatism is not just another political philosophy akin to liberalism or conservatism. This strikes the heart of Canada, and fairly obviously so. That's where I think that there's a problem with this.
So, John, you take it, you take them for their word at the CBC that they won't be harnessing Gilles Duceppe as some sort of mule to carry the anti-conservative government message. You kind of trust them.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Gilles Duceppe is a social democrat, right? He's not going to agree with conservative policies, and that's fine. I don't think Gilles Duceppe is anybody's mule, though. I mean, except in that he's probably quite balky if he's trying to get him to carry a burden where you want him to carry it. You know, Duceppe is his own man, for better or worse. It's just I don't see why they put him on the public broadcaster.
John, I want to go to a quote. Back in 1977, Trudeau stated in an interview that he was very concerned about the possibility of CBC Radio-Canada propagandizing separatism. That's what Trudeau said back in 1977. He was concerned. What do you think? Well, I think that Trudeau was sort of, 70% idiot and 30% very perceptive, and that was in the very perceptive category. That he was aware of the danger, he understood the nature of the Quebec elite and of Quebec political culture, and he realized very well that there was likely to be kind of a long march through the institutions by the separatists, that they would rightly understand the importance of capturing something like Radio-Canada, and also that the kind of people who would be good at doing that kind of job were also very likely to have separatist affiliations. He knew exactly what he was talking about, and he was right. And it's an ongoing problem. And again, I regret that it is a fact that separatism is a prominent current in Quebec public life, that very many people are sympathetic to the idea of Quebec as a nation that should be independent, even if they can't be bothered to raise their arm, bring the hammer down, and bust up Canada. And in that sense, there's nothing that unusual about it, but it's just weird. And again, the Harper Tories putting up someone like James Moore, I was thinking the hapless James Moore. I think we need to attach that adjective to him because he's quite hapless in the portfolio that he manages. But John, saying, oh, well, we gave them more money for national unity. It's like that's not what's happening over there. Please see it clearly, John,
sir.
I know that intellectual consistency is somebody's hobgoblin, hobgoblin of the mediocre, whatever Emerson was saying about intellectual consistency.
Which
but
was
I'm
totally
looking for
daffy.
It was, but I'm looking for some here. On the one hand, you're willing to admit that CBC Radio-Canada was used as a mule by the people who wanted to separate Quebec from the rest of Canada, so you'll admit that. Trudeau admitted in 1977 that CBC Radio-Canada was going to use itself as a mule, but you, John Robson, won't admit tonight that one of the things that motivates CBC Radio-Canada to hire Gilles Duceppe is they want to continue to be a mule.
No, of course, they've hired him in part because of his sympathy for separatism. They think his take on cultural and economic issues will further it. Not as a kind of a guide, a stick with which to beat the Conservatives in a partisan sense. Duceppe isn't like that, but he's philosophically consistent enough that they don't need him to do that. You get him on board, you get him talking, he will speak to the cultural assumptions of the separatist crowd, and he will do it in an eloquent and logical kind of way. He will be good, I think, at what they've hired him to do, and that's bad.
And in doing so, give as much legitimacy to separatism as possible by giving as much legitimacy and Canadian tax dollars to one of their favorite icons. John, thank you, as always, for the visit.
My pleasure.
John Robson, columnist, Ottawa Sun. Do you have an opinion on the CBC? If so, we encourage you to email your thoughts to our government. to the hapless James Moore. He'd love to hear what Adler Nation viewers think. He can be reached by email at james.moore@parle.gc.ca.